Hello and welcome to a very, very special episode of the Pakistan Experience. It's been a few years since I've met this gentleman, at least digitally, at least virtually. He's one of my favorite people in the world to talk to. I'm in constant awe of his brilliance, his discipline. Manu S. Pillai. He's here to discuss his new book. First of all, how are you doing, sir?
I'm doing very well, and thank you for the very kind words. You're right, it's been many years. I'm trying to think of when the last time was. Was it 2020 or 21? I think it was around the COVID time that we had our last conversation.
I think that's how all your conversations work, right? Like you have a book that comes out, then you do this run of podcasts and conferences, and then you go into your office and then you work on another masterpiece. And dare I say it, maybe Ivory Throne is your magnus opus, but this also comes close. Gods, Guns, Missionaries, the making of the modern Hindu identity. I'm sure you've heard it a million times
Two
already, but
different kinds of books, completely
what a
different kinds of books.
what a phenomenal book this is. I think you have he inspired many writers like me. I just completed my manuscript and I've emailed my publisher to hold on to it because if you're writing books like this, I don't think anybody else deserves to
So,
publish anything.
congratulations. It's still a great milestone finishing a manuscript, even if it's just the first draft and it needs work. It's still, the most of the legwork is done. So, that's a good bit of news.
So let's just jump into this. I think in many ways, most religious identities are political identities. They emerge at a certain time. But when we talk about Abrahamic traditions, the fact that they're centered around a prophet and then they're centered around a book, there is a codified document to turn back to. It may be molded into different directions. So before we even get
Yeah.
into the book, the notion of the Hindu identity, I think, especially in a country like Pakistan, where we tend to view a lot of things from the prism of religion, and Hinduism or Hindu identity historically emerged as a cultural identity east of uh, everything east of Indus, the Hind, the Sindhu, the Ind, and then it was collated around as a religious identity as well. So, fully aware of the pitfalls of me falling into colonial descriptions and edicts of what is a religious identity and what is a political identity. But just to lay the scene, what do you think of these notions of what is a religious identity and what is a political identity? And do these rivers tend to run parallel or they stream in without us even realizing?
I'm glad you mentioned the bit about Abrahamic religions because even when you do have a prophet, even when you do have a core set of scriptures or a core book, there's still 20,000 disagreements that people have. There are still multiple sects that can emerge and they will fight over who has the right interpretation of things, whether the right kind of prophets are being worshipped, which prophet is ranked where. Islam and Christianity have their own sort of
Mm.
disagreements on this, even though they recognize, like Islam will recognize Jesus as a Messiah of God and so on, but at the same time, will not acknowledge anything beyond that. So this, even when you do have codes, even when you do have scripture, even when you have that kind of outline that can perhaps help define religion a certain way, it's still not easy because culture, politics, human interests at different points of time, vested interests at different points of time, all of this play into religion. Religion isn't something that emerged in some kind of pristine, fully shaped form from descended from the heavens in that sense. Even if, say, a message of God, as it were received. The point is that subsequent generations each have their own way of addressing that, of looking at that. The difference with the Hindu tradition is that in many ways, it's not as if you have one fount and then branching off into multiple sects. It's often the other way around, which is that different sects coalesce and come together into what we now call Hinduism. So it's really more of a cultural fabric. It's really more of a framework. That shared framework, in many ways, is what we now condense under the term Hinduism, as opposed to a core set of beliefs or a core set of texts or a core set of practices. Practices vary widely, texts also vary widely, though there is, in some vague kind of echo of the Abrahamic system, most Hindu traditions do acknowledge the Vedas as supreme, but their direct relevance to the Vedas is very, very limited. It's like one of those things where you say that, the Vedas matter, but we don't necessarily know what is in it. It's there, we recognize it as the gold standard, and that sort of holds a lot of these traditions together. So it's a much more loose, much more fluid kind of system that existed. But religions also evolve because of others, in the sense that religious identity, even if it's Christianity, if you look at the history of Christianity, it was against the Jews and
Jews.
Judaism that it sort of does form its own self-image. And as it forms its self-image, Judaism also forms its own more rigid, more solidified kind of
Mm.
self-image. So religions need to play off something other than themselves in order to define who they are, or in order to define what it is. And Hinduism also, it's the same. You do find that in the medieval period, certain traditions such as Shaivism, Vaishnavism, Shaktism, they had their own internal quarrels in India. But compared to, say, Buddhism and Jainism on the other side, they recognize that we belong in one camp and those belong in another camp. So there's internal differences, but at the same time, there's a kind of broad categorization that is also visible. Then, with the coming of Islam into the Indian subcontinent, you start seeing that the word Hindu itself, which comes from outside India, becomes more and more popular. And slowly, at an intellectual level, you start seeing people such as Vidyapati, Kabir, Eknath in Maharashtra, different parts of India in different periods in the medieval and late medieval period, beginning to sort of use the word Hindu for one broad categorization of people, and Turk or Turk for Muslims as the other broad categorization. The important thing again here is that neither are monoliths. I mean, we know Hindus are definitely not a monolithic system, but it's not true that Islam was a monolithic identity either. In the book, at some point, I have a bit about how
About
the
Kerala.
Muslim League. Yes, no, and Kerala is of course there, but even Kashmir, when the Muslim League
Yeah.
sends off in the 1940s somebody to Kashmir to sort of build some momentum over there, the man comes back very
They're
disappointed.
not
He
even
says these guys are
Muslims.
not practicing Islam. Yeah, they need to be re-instructed in Islam because their
Yeah.
saint worship, their local practices are so heavily influenced by culture that somebody coming from North India, from the
Mm,
the northern provinces of India as opposed to Kashmir or the
mm,
south, was completely flabbergasted by what he saw in Kashmir. If they came to Kerala and saw a matrilineal royal family where the women got to rule and
mm,
matrimony has no connection to Islamic law, etc., in quotes, at the same time it was valid over there, right? So neither Hindus nor Muslims are a monolith, at least in the South Asian subcontinent. Yet at the same time, there is a
mm.
broad sense that there are elements that hold these respective identities together.
Yeah. I think you've spoken about Kabir, mentioning that Hindus and Turks are different. Then in the book, you also mentioned that Brahmins try to claim Kabir by claiming no, actually his actual lineage is Brahmin as well. So there is also this claim to cultural figures like that. And I think what the entire book is about is how, in opposition to something, when something new comes up, like you've spoken with Amit Verma about, if there are five brown people, when a white person comes, you're a lot more conscious of your brown identity. Or recently, as a Muslim, post 9/11, with the notion of Islamophobia, especially Muslims in the West had a much more entrenched identity of what it means to be Muslim, and then movements like Sharia and the UK prop up. So that's
Yeah.
probably the experience of many people in the Indian subcontinent as well years ago. In terms of the book, in terms of interpretations, I think the debate then becomes between Catholics and Protestants. But what we have is actually the right religion, and what your religion is the corruption of what actual text was, what it originally was. Is the same with Islamic sects as well. Would you differentiate that from the emergence of Hinduism as a religion? Because what it needed to do was not to necessarily debate the correct interpretation, but was to allow for multiplicity, was to allow for plurality, to say what we are now encountering, whether it's initially in terms of Buddhism, then in terms of Islam, then in terms of Christianity, this is something different to us, but everything else, we will allow for it. It'll be a bottom up approach. All of you are welcome. What we are, we might not know, but we are different from this. And then as we go along in the book, we'll see how different Hindu scholars have tried to define what we are.
You know, when the first missionaries come into India, they are coming from a worldview where they are convinced that there is only one path to God. That path is through Christianity, and the Bible is the word of God. Essentially, I'm simplifying, but that's the
Mm,
outline that they come from, that they come with. And that's their view of the world as well, as far as all religious identity is concerned. So for them, this is the path to God. Anything that is not this is necessarily monstrous, it is satanic, it is not the right thing. It is not worshipping God, it is worshipping the devil. In India, they encounter this very laissez-faire kind of situation. And it's, by the way, earlier pagan cultures, such as in Greece and Rome, etc., also you find, in the ancient period, intellectuals making similar cases, where they'd be like, look, we're not saying your path to God through the Bible is wrong. We're just saying that that is a path to God, not the path to God. Because God has created multiple paths. There are different cultures in the world. There are different groups of people in the world. In fact, the first Protestant missionary comes and says, there's one path to God. And somebody lampoons him saying that, different languages, different races in the world, what are diversity practices in heaven? Can people even understand each other with all these different languages? There's Francois Bernier who travels and sees some Brahmins doing some morning rituals with water, and he says, look, this can't be mandated by God, because if God had mandated it, you would freeze to death in Europe because it's so cold, you can't stand in water for an hour in the morning. To which the Brahmins reply, said, we are never saying that this is for you. We are saying that for us over here, God has mandated this. For you in Europe, God has mandated something else. For you in Europe, God's Son has appeared as Jesus. For us, God has appeared in Vishnu's 10 avatars,
mm,
which, by the way, groups of Muslims in Gujarat, etc., the Ismailis and so on, consider Ali one of Vishnu's avatars, thereby fusing Islam and Hinduism as well. So that idea that there are multiple paths to God and not one path to God is central to what a lot of these Hindu intellectuals are telling missionaries in this period from different parts of the country in
mm,
different centuries once the European encounter starts. So I think that is a very critical element in this. And the irony is that as late as the early 20th century, when someone like Bal Gangadhar Tilak, this great Congress leader of the time, but also in some ways the grandfather of Hindu nationalism, he was
mm.
something of a guru to Savarkar, who
Savarkar.
defines contemporary Hindutva. When he tries to define the word Hindutva, he does include the idea that to be a Hindu, you need to recognize multiple paths to God. That comes out of, I think, that old, in quotes, pagan tradition, which is that there are so many traditions, different tribes, different cults, different
Mm,
groups all coming together. So it's not just the Hindus were somehow wiser and they thought that there are multiple ways to God. It's just that in your own internal tradition within India, there are so many internal roots, there are so many internal sects. Even Brahmins themselves, there will be Sama Shaivas, Sama Vaishnavas, Sama Smartas, some will believe in temple worship, others will say temple worship is bad. So the Brahmins alone have so many different viewpoints on it, and they
mm,
consider that all of these are valid in their own ways. They will hierarchize it. They will say that, okay, one is better,
mm.
the other is slightly less better, or it's inferior. But the point is, they won't deny the validity of these different paths.
Yeah.
So they had that internal logic. So when they met Christianity and Islam, etc., it was the same logic that they brought, which is that yes, we respect you, we accept you, but you are a path to God, not the path to God. This, for Europeans, was very difficult to get their head around because they came out of a tradition where that could no longer be possible. God's word had only come out in one way. And I think one of the missionaries says as much that God, this is not like some buffet, right, where you can go and pick and choose what you want. The
Mm,
Hindu says that yes, God is like a shopkeeper, and to attract different customers, he has different products on his counter for each group.
mm,
Whereas they're like, no, 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 God is not a shopkeeper. God is above all this. And since God's message is only one, there can only be one path to God.
mm,
So this is that multiplicity is intrinsic to Hinduism in that sense. What happens though is that exposure to Christian missionaries, especially Protestant missionaries from the 18th century onwards, who are much more rigid. The Catholics come and they adapt Christianity to Hinduism. They accept
mm,
castes, they accept a lot of local practices, they accept a lot of local customs. There are Catholic converts who go and do goat sacrifices to Christian saints, just as they do goat sacrifices to the goddess Kali. In the church, lower caste people are made to sit at the back or not enter. Upper caste people sit in front. So Catholicism adapts, or even one would even say Hinduizes Christianity and melds and in some ways merges into this local system. So Catholic priests can wear saffron robes, they can have a tika, they'll do arti as in temples. So they become Hinduized. Protestants are reluctant to do that. And the Protestant advent also coincides with the rise of British power in India. So they also feel that they have power in their hand. So they don't need to adjust as much as, say, the Catholics did earlier in most parts of India. Catholics were also violent in Goa where they had power, but in other parts of India, they
mm,
didn't have that kind of power. So faced with that, you find that modern Hindu reformers like Ram Mohan Roy, etc., they take a very Protestant reading of what the outline of a religion should be. So they say, yes, religions need scripture. So Ram Mohan Roy says, yes, we will now focus on the Upanishads, or broadly speaking, the Vedas. Then he'll say that, okay, just as the Protestants say that there was Christian scripture, it was corrupted by the Catholic Church, and then there was the Protestant Reformation to revive pure, pristine Christianity. By the same logic, he would say there were the Upanishads of the Vedic
mm,
tradition, where God was this abstract entity. There were no temples, there was no idol worship. Nothing that the West dislikes is allowed. And then we got corrupted into temple worship and idolatry and all that. And now we also need a reformation. So there is a kind of Protestantization of Hinduism that takes place in these intellectual circles in the 19th century, where they look at Islam and Christianity, etc., and they're like, okay, this is how they model religion in order to not, I mean, on the one hand, you're accepting that conceptual outline. You're saying we should also model religion this way, but you're doing it to defend yourself from the missionary. You're doing it to defend yourself from losing your religious identity. So it's a very complicated process in play. And the way I end in the book is, there's a missionary who says that, oh, modern Hinduism is just Christian wine in Hindu bottles. And my argument is it's the other way around. It's actually Hindu wine, but now in Christian bottles as opposed to some earlier version of Hindu bottles.
Mm. You're already on the native Luthers. If we may go back, I think you mentioned paganism, which is used pejoratively, whether it's Islam or Christianity, because the idea is that there was a society which was corrupted, which was already pagan, and then God particularly sent a prophet to fix this. So paganism is viewed as a with a pejorative lens, and maybe a lot of people in the subcontinent, especially in the Hindu tradition, had maybe adopted that idea and were viewing it like that. But there has been a recent reclaiming of the idea that what's the problem with even being pagan as such. Right at the start, you mentioned that even before, and if I have the timeline wrong, please correct me. Even before this interaction with the other, there was already a national evolution as well, with from worshipping Agni. And I think I've seen enough Bollywood movies and enough Bollywood heroines to be like, Agni pe shakshi mankar main tumse shaadi karungi, to think that Agni means fire. So maybe in a lot of societies around the world, there was this natural evolution from worshipping fire to certain religions being developed. So from fire to Shiva or certain deities being revered, that maybe was a
Yeah.
natural evolution as opposed to then the political identity becoming a lot more central when it's interacted with the Muslim empire or the Christian missionaries. Is that accurate?
I mean, the thing is when you have a system where there are multiple gods and these gods are all attractive, and it's often the case that, say, a person for different purposes can go to different gods. I think in the last time we spoke as well, I gave the example of how the Maratha Bakhars talk about how the great Hindutva hero and the great Hindu hero of the 17th century, Chhatrapati Shivaji in Maharashtra, he did conceptualize his sovereignty in very Hindu terms and against Islamic rulers. That's very clear in his court poetry, etc.
But
But
his
when his
father was
grandparents
named
couldn't,
after a
yeah,
Sufi saint,
Muslim Sufi, right?
Shah
Because his
Sharif.
grandparents couldn't have children, they went to multiple gods, multiple temples, did multiple vows. It was finally by going to Shah Sharif that they apparently had these two sons. So they said, okay, this is the god, this is the person, this is the holy man who's blessed us. Among the Rajputs, in northern India, in Rajputana, there's a group called the Shekhawats. That's also again because apparently that particular clan of Rajputs, their ancestor was blessed by Sheikh Burhan, and since then all his children were called and all their descendants were called Shekhawats. So there again, you see there's a mix and match that takes place. And within these so-called pagan traditions, that mix and match was very possible. For different purposes, you could go to different gods. Say, if you want a child, you'll go to a certain god. If you want, I don't know, some kind of monetary advancement, you'll go to another god. I don't know, someone in your family has mental health issues. Someone will come and tell you, oh, such and such
Everyone,
inferior god.
everyone in my family, man.
Well, I'll tell you which gods to go to. So it's almost like you can address your offerings and your desires to different gods based on the need of the moment. And this attitude sort of existed for the longest time in Hinduism. But because of this also, I think sometimes gods would go in and out of fashion. It's not an exact correlation, but for example, after modern technology came in, modern transport came in, moving around has become a lot easier. There are some temples in India that have really boomed in practice. For example, Sabrimala in Kerala, where I come from, where we have a bachelor god called Ayyappan, and you have to trek up a hill for a few hours to get to his shrine on top of the hill. There's a whole process. You have to wear black. It doesn't recognize caste, so anybody can go. Women aren't allowed. Fertile women are not allowed because the deity is a brahmachari. So children are allowed, and women over 50 are allowed, but not the middle age, and that's a bit controversial as well. But the point is that you can this boom in Ayyappan's popularity is partly also linked to technological changes, more and more people becoming aware, etc. By that same sort of general yardstick, at different points of time, different gods became more or less popular. So Indra, Agni, etc. were Vedic gods of a certain period. But when that Vedic tradition came into contact with other traditions within the Indian subcontinent, these tribal cults, these local traditions, etc., there was a kind of fusing. So it had to incorporate some of those gods. Some of their gods got accepted by these other cultures, and there was a fusing taking place in which Hinduism, as we know it, takes form. In that process, some new gods became, or rather, certain gods became relegated to the back burner. Other gods became more immediately important. So Vishnu and Shiva became the two big gods, and of course, the great goddess Shakti, or in general Parvati, whatever you want to call her. The idea of the goddess also becomes firm. So these three become the main sort of cults or the main sort of groupings, and other gods are in various ways connected to them. So Vishnu, he has multiple avatars. So various gods, including in some readings, the Buddha is connected to his avatars, and through that, a network of linkages is created. For Shiva, it is the idea of his retinue, his sons, Ganapati, Kartikeya, and all of his sons and his family, his wife. and his retinue. Through that, another set of gods is connected to Shiva. So a few broad groupings take place, almost like you have a tent or a pyramid within which there is a supreme or higher god, and then there are these subordinate levels of gods. And these higher gods are also competing. So in the Vishnu
Mm.
Purana of the Puranic text, Vishnu is supreme and Shiva is shown as inferior to Vishnu. In the Shiva Purana, it is Shiva who's supreme and Vishnu is shown as inferior to Shiva because they are also competing among each other. And as time passes, you find that royal dynasties in India, for example, at a certain point, become more and more Vaishnava. They start promoting more and more of Vishnu as opposed to being Shaivite. So the Mysore royal family, I think it's in the 17th century that they give up their Shaivite identity and transfer their allegiances to Vishnu. So these aren't happening very far off either, literally a few centuries ago. As late as the 19th century, there was this Maharaja in Jaipur called Ram Singh. He overnight changed his allegiances and went around, I think, persecuting Vaishnavites in Jaipur and kicking them out of his court and things like that. So that when you have multiples, you also have a intrinsic competition. I'd even say a healthy competition between the gods. And at different moments, different gods become popular or they lose some of their popularity. So Indra and Agni may have lost their popularity, but knowing the Hindu tradition, it's very likely in 500 years from now, we'll be back with one of them or
Mm.
something completely different from the Vedas. And some other gods might be relegated to the backseat.
I'm fully conscious of the fact that we should not read modern sensibilities into the past, but just to find a way into these discussions, something that I've noticed is when you see Islamic preachers in the West, they tend to be a lot more accepting because the crowd that they're preaching to is mainly not Muslim. So they need to make Islam a lot more accepting that even if you commit these sins, you're still welcome into the mosque. Whereas in a country which is majoritarian Islam, like Pakistan, the constant discussion is that even if you don't pray, once you're outside the fold of Islam, you're not called a Muslim because the power comes from who's a better Muslim. So when we talk about Hinduism particularly and all the what you speak about is what it means to be Hindu may not be a declared identity. It manifests itself in the practices, in your daily practices, and an undercurrent throughout the book will become to Savarkar, who's right at the end, like a Game of Thrones prologue. You leave a spoiler right at the end with that. I think his success lies in doing away with that discussion altogether. And throughout the book, we see people struggling with this ideas that with Brahminism, what it means to be Brahmin, what it means to be a Hindu, is the practice, and central to that practice is the caste practice, and every single ritual revolves around that in particular. But with the advent of colonialism, with the advent of census, which we'll come to later, you need to be a lot more accepting. So, necessarily to create that modern Hindu identity, did people have to do away with central edicts of what they believed to be their religion or Brahminism at least?
I think there's one very important thing in this is the Brahmin as a character is a very important figure in bringing together a lot of these traditions. There
Mm,
may be disparate traditions. They may in different degrees be Brahminical or have bought into the Brahminical ideology, or they could be completely local in origin. But it's often through Brahminical texts that there is some kind of narrative cohesion offered to this. It's still not perfect. The analogy I use somewhere is like a tapestry that's constantly expanding in every direction. It's not got a particular shape, and yet it's part of the same fabric, because at that juncture forming a shape is not part of its goals, because it's just wedding together all of these diverse traditions. Faced with rivals, however, it starts knitting out of its outer borders. It starts to realize that maybe we need a shape in order to determine where that begins and where we begin, as a kind of differentiation. So the Brahmin is very important to all of these processes. At the same time, it is true that caste was significantly important. So again, to go back to Bal Gangadhar Tilak, he was a man who wanted a modern Hindu identity. He wanted Hindus of all these different shades and hues to think of themselves as one political grouping called Hindus, as one majoritarian grouping called Hindus. But at the same time, he was unwilling to give up caste, because he also thought that those caste identities forget the unequal nature of the process, but they also represent those granular identities within Hinduism. So when he is a specific kind of Chitpavan Brahmin from
mm,
Maharashtra, he has certain specific caste practices, and his engagement with religion is mediated through that particular caste identity. His rivals will be Deshastha Brahmins, also from the same region. They will have certain peculiarities to them that is very important to their identity. When they go to, say, Banaras, they will be seen as Maharashtrian Brahmins, and they'll see the North Indian Brahmin who has a very different set of practices. They come to Kerala, they'll see the Nambudiri Brahmin has very different kinds of practices. So for Tilak, those caste based views of religion were very important because they were also just as legitimate as this overarching majoritarian identity. But the problem is that because caste is also linked to an unequal social structure, because it also entails ritual purity, ritual impurity, untouchability, and who is touchable, questions around that, that became a bit of a problem because naturally exposure to the modern world, exposure to ideas of equality, etc., meant that these things would not fly. So it's still a very complicated. It's not just Tilak's generation, the 19th and early 20th centuries. Even now in 21st century India, modern Hindutva still grapples with this question of caste, which is that yes, we want you to be Hindus and identify primarily as Hindus, but then what about these caste identities? What about the fact that Hindus are also capable of tearing away at this identity on the basis of caste? Both can be simultaneously true. Numbers also matter because again, it's in the modern period with the British censuses coming in that the Hindus even form the notion that we are a majority as opposed to other minorities here. So we have the greater stake and we have the greater hold and the greater claim to the country as opposed to other groupings. So then what happens is that you find a lot of, as you go down the caste ladder, especially in the Dalit communities or the so-called ex-untouchable communities, over there you find that their religion is a lot more porous, and they themselves are very much on the peripheries of Hindu society, partly in but not entirely in, partly accepted because upper caste Hindus need their service, but also rejected because they're seen as ritually impure and completely defiled, untouchable, literally. And in places where I come from Kerala, even unapproachable. They could not even approach you within a certain distance or within 12 feet or 15 feet or whatever it was. Now it becomes important to get rid of caste because to maintain your majoritarian strength, you need as many numbers as possible. So bringing the Dalits in becomes a very important part of developing this modern majoritarian idea of the Hindu identity. That's why people like Savarkar, etc., are bolder than Tilak, where he says caste has to go. So he organizes these dinners where all the castes will sit together. He gives the Brahmin sacred thread to Dalit groups, etc. He's still buying into that Brahminical notion of that the sacred thread matters, but he's trying to get past the idea of caste and he's trying to get past these internal differences. But that fragility still remains in that Hindu identity, in the politically alert Hindu identity. But even now, most Hindus' lived practices are very much based on their respective family practices, their respective caste practices.
Yeah.
Because of globalization, there is now some movement of this here and there. I think in the past also customs did evolve with time, but perhaps now it's happening faster in a different way. For example, someone was telling me that Karwa Chauth, which is practiced primarily in parts of northern India where women
Mm.
perform certain rites and they fast, etc., for their husbands, it's now being performed in places like Bangalore in the south. Where I come from in Kerala, now at weddings you'll see women wearing sindoor. But sindoor was not traditionally worn in Kerala even 30, 40 years ago. Now all the women are wearing it because it's something that's come in from northern India. And people think that it's now traditional to do that. They forget that in their tradition, it's not part of their tradition, but it is part of some broader notion of a Hindu tradition. And they feel that Hindu women should all wear sindoor. So there is some interaction of that nature happening. But even now, most orthodox traditional people's idea and experience of religion is mediated through caste, is mediated through their family identities and networks. And it's not based on some intellectualized reading of Hinduism. That is something intellectuals faced with missionaries, faced with Europeans, faced with British rule in India, and of course, not part of this book, but someone else could write a book on this, faced with the presence of Islam, felt that they had to define Hinduism in a certain way. So there is an intellectualized textbook Hinduism, there is a real Hinduism that is actually practiced by people, and the two are in constant dialogue, but sometimes also in constant tension with each other.
Yeah, I think Karwa Chauth is Karan Johar's fault. A lot of people blame him for the universalization of these festivals. I think
I,
it's akin to
I've also heard that many of the women in the South, especially, do not actually do the fasting, but it's like a photo shoot in the age of social media. You want to show that you've done Karwa Chauth,
they
but that's
want their
about it.
DDLJ moment ना.
Yeah.
मैंने भी पूरा दिन नहीं what the sister says ना राज ने भी पूरा दिन कुछ नहीं खाया दीदी. They want that BDLJ moment for them. And
You clearly watched far more Bollywood than me.
you know these would you rather me talk about Bahubali and
Good Lord, no, I've watched. Have I watched? Yes, I think I watched Bahubali because it was such a sensation when it came out. But I watched very few movies, so my
Manu,
my
as a
pop culture
Vampire
references,
Diaries
whether
super fan, you have no right to judge me. As somebody who binge watches
I'm not,
Vampire
I'm not
Diaries,
I'm not judging you. I'm not judging you at all. I'm just surprised. That's all. I'm just mildly surprised. And thank you
everybody
for
in
revealing
Pakistan.
the Vampire Diaries. Yeah.
Everybody in Pakistan grows up on Bollywood. At least people in the urban centers. I think that was our access to Indian culture in general. I think it's
Oh,
this.
and we had a phase in India where everybody was in love with your actor Fawad Khan, I think. He was very popular in India
Yes.
at one time when relations were still pretty decent. I remember a whole phase when he was like this big sensation.
Fingers crossed he's back. Fingers crossed. There's a teaser for this new movie that he's in. I think this maybe this current Joharization of India is akin to uh, what you mentioned in terms of festivals like Shivaji festival and how they were popularized of that time. But what I want to get at is uh, you know who Sanjay Rajoda is?
No.
He's a stand-up comedian who made some jokes about uh, Ganesh, and then he got into trouble for that. But it was rather surprising that these were discussions which were commonly had and from within the tradition, that certain notions or certain religious beliefs that you had, let alone at the start when you mentioned the missionaries encountering that and thinking of all
Yeah.
of these as the devil. But even within the tradition, there was a question that if somebody was born out of the mouth, then does the uterus exists there? These discussions were being had at the public square or maybe the Twitter of that time. And the tradition allowed for these discussions to happen without necessarily mob lynching the people uh, who are having these discussions.
I mean, there are two, three ways to look at it. Yes, if you look at the 19th century and you look at some of the things all these people wrote, whether it's Tilak, whether it is Ram Mohan Roy in the early 19th
Mhm,
century. For example, Ram Mohan Roy did, as I said, buy into that Protestantized idea of religion, where he thought true Hinduism was only in the Vedas. It had to have an abstract God.
mhm,
Temple worship was bad. Puranic stories were bad. So his writings on, say, the songs sung at Kali's festivals, the animal sacrifices, the wording he uses, or Krishna and his romantic sort of songs about him and the gopis, etc. Ramon Roy is very puritanical about this in a very missionary way himself. And he says, no, 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 this is all very bad. And he doesn't even want to talk about Kali and her licentiousness and things like
mhm,
that. That's Ram Mohan Roy. Then there's someone like Jyotiba Phule, the one you're talking about, the whole
mhm,
uterus example, where he says that Brahmins claim they're superior because they were born from the head of the cosmic creator. And then he asks, does that mean that there's a uterus over there as well, and whether the cosmic creator menstruated through the mouth? This is Phule writing in the 19th century. But I don't think anyone today could get away with
mhm,
making such statements, or even polemically asking such questions, because there's other reasons, apolitical climate and timing and all of that comes into play. So yes, there was that kind of questioning that took place. I think part of it was also possible because the literary slash intellectual circles in which these debates were taking place were
mhm,
relatively small at the time. They were taking place in these urban nodes, they were taking place in these literate circles in a time when most people were not literate. So it's not as if so Ramon Roy, even though he also published a lot of his writings in Bengali, the average Bengali peasant of the time was not literate. So it's not like this is trickling down at a mass level to people.
mhm,
He's still ultimately targeting an intelligent, well-read, literate circle of people and trying to spark certain ideas in them. What's happened in our time is because of globalization, because of the internet, because of the fact that now you have 4G and you may still be illiterate, but you can see through videos, etc., snippets that come directly to your phone over WhatsApp. That circle has widened substantially. It's no longer just a group of people who are trying to understand the point being made, but people
mhm,
who perhaps do not have that much exposure. At the same time, they're also being able to consume this, which means that the sensitivities are also higher. There's also, therefore, I think, a larger set of people who are likely to be,
mhm,
in quotes, offended compared to when Ramon Roy and that generation of people were writing. And remember, they knew how to give, but they also knew how to take it. So Phule did write lots of things critical of caste, but Phule was also lampooned by traditional Orthodox writers in similar Marathi papers, especially upper caste Orthodox Brahmins, etc. They would also lampoon him and hit back at him, calling him a missionary in Hindu clothing, a white man in a brown man's skin, and things like that. So I think the timing of when these debates takes place also matters. It was not as if the world was freer in that time. I think the world was just as conservative then. It's just that the number of people exposed to these things was perhaps smaller, and therefore some of these conversations could be had in a way that
mhm.
we no longer can have freely.
My notion from reading the book was the debates with the Christian missionaries. They seem to be happening at the public square because they were being
Oh
had
yes.
with the purpose of there being an audience, because they're not being had to reach the truth in some academic circle or at a university of that time. They were being had with the intent purpose of converting people. So the people had to hear them, and it was a case of our religion is better, hence come to our side. So they were being had in the public square, right?
I mean, that takes me back to a statement you made right at the start of this conversation, where you said religious identities are also political identities, right? None of this is purely about faith. We're not talking really about faith. Right at the beginning of the book, I say that this is about action and reaction in a time of political domination. It's about human beings and politics and power. It's not really about faith. If it's about faith, okay, I believe in Jesus, you don't believe in Jesus, that's okay. I will still hold on to my faith. But no, this is about political identity. This is about identity. And the moment the word identity comes in, you know it's political in nature.
Mhm.
When the first missionaries come in, they're actually having these debates often, of course, in places like Goa, where they have political power, they are ruthless. After a while, you find that there is forced demolitions of temples, forced conversions of people. They're even told to give up their culture. So local music can't be used, local names for
Yeah.
children can't be used. You have to Europeanize as much as you Christianize. Yet that was a small part of India. In most of India, as these Christian missionaries went in, it was still largely Hindu ruled India, largely under Hindu Rajas, etc. But even in their courts, they would have debates, and these would happen in front of the Raja's court. And then you find, for example, in Calicut, there was a Father Fenicio who would lampoon Krishna again, saying Krishna's
Mm.
dancing around with gopis. How can he actually be God? You worship this God called Ganapati, but he has the head of an elephant, a giant belly, and he's moving around on a mouse or a rat. How can this be God? To which the Hindus will also lampoon back, and they'll say that, oh, you believe in the virgin birth. That doesn't make sense to us. If Jesus was God's son, then how did he end up on a cross? Did God have no better way of saving mankind than making his own son suffer? So each side would take pot shots at each other in a courtly kind of audience that was there. What happens is that as time passes, you find this first Protestant missionary, Ziegenbach, coming in the 18th
Yeah.
century.
German.
He engages in literary exchanges. So he's writing letters to these Hindu Brahmins and gurus across several parts of Tamil Nadu and South India, trying to ask, A, why do you not accept Christianity? What is your issue with
Mm.
my religion? And also trying to understand what the Hindu religion is all about to see how he can then address those gaps in his own understanding. And of course, some of it is pretty funny. These Hindu interlocutors are very upset that white people who come here saying that Indians need to be civilized and that Indians and Hindus are barbaric. These are people who don't even wash their bottoms after going to the
Yeah.
toilet. So what? And this is a culture where ritual purity is very important,
Mm.
right? You take multiple baths in a day to keep yourself pure. And here are people who go to the toilet and don't wash. So they're like, we're not going to take any lectures from you. And Ziegenbach is told as much. But at the same time, there's also more intellectual exchange that's taking place. 19th century is when you start seeing that there's a flip because there's an evangelical movement growing in Britain. That
Mm.
movement is putting pressure on the British Parliament. As a consequence of that, in India, missionaries are being allowed greater and greater access. They feel that they are empowered and they are on the civilizing mission over here. Remember that most East India Company officials actually on the ground in India did not want missionaries there. They thought missionaries and interfering in religion would mean that their own soldiers, their own brown soldiers, would mutiny because they would feel that their identity was under attack and they didn't want to take the risk. In fact, at one point, as the book shows, the East India Company men and officials were actually not only tolerant of Hinduism, but actively
Yeah.
patronizing Hinduism. They're escorting gods and goddesses in procession. It's company troops
Mm.
that are doing this. They're making donations at temples in Surat, etc. Annually, the local governor or lord is expected to smash coconuts by the sea. If the British official will go, he'll also smash coconuts by the sea and make
Mm.
offerings to the sea god. They are participating in Hindu traditions and Hindu rites. And Hindu society is also reciprocating. You find Brahmins are willing to work with them. Brahmins are writing Sanskrit poetry praising the British, saying that you're protecting our temples, etc.
Mm.
But the missionary lobby's pressure means that there is a slow shift in policy. And now missionaries come in the 19th century at a time where they feel empowered by the support of the state because they've been able to build up enough of pressure in Britain, enough of pressure at home. So now they're standing and proselytizing in front of temples. Now they're standing and distributing pamphlets outside temples and melas and big festivals. You even have the odd case where missionary writings themselves speak of how missionaries are waving these pamphlets in the faces of Brahmins who are in the middle of something. So there's a kind of gentle or not so gentle goading
Mm.
that's taking place. It is at this juncture that the Brahmins and the Hindus also start organizing the way in which they respond to this. So now, earlier it's just simple taking pot shots at each other in a king's in a king's darbar, including Akbar's darbar, where Akbar also had the Mughal Emperor Akbar also had the Ibadat Khana, where debates like this would take place. But now it's happening in a different kind of public sphere where newspapers are involved. So a missionary and a Hindu set of gurus will meet, they'll have a debate. Then their respective factions will publish reports of this in newspapers. They'll put out articles and pamphlets and writings about
Mm.
this. Some of these are huge spectacles. In Bombay, etc., hundreds and thousands of people would gather by the beach, and there'd be debates taking place in the 1830s, in the 1840s. Rejoinders would be written to the missionaries in local languages, including, of course, a regional language, but also in Sanskrit. And remember, just as Hindus are having these debates with missionaries, Muslims are also having them. I went into that research a little bit. Then I realized I can't cram everything into one book. So
Mm,
that deserves a separate book in its own right. Islam's encounter with Hinduism, but also Islam's encounter with Christian missionaries in this period. Because Muslims also felt under siege, and there were Muslims also converting to Christianity. So in this space in the 19th century, this becomes slightly more, for want of a better word, toxic, in the sense that because now it's happening through new technology, it's happening through new media,
mm,
and the Protestant missionary seems to be a bit smug. The Protestant missionary seems to be backed by the state. As I said, the British state is actually very ambiguous and ambivalent about this. They're not entirely pro-missionary, but to the Indians, it looks like, how can the missionary come to our temple and preach like this so rudely if he did not have the support of the missionary? When Awadh is annexed, the rumor is that, oh, now the Governor General is going to send a whole brigade of missionaries into Awadh to convert everybody. When small changes in Vellore are made to the uniforms of the soldiers, and their mustache is standardized and their turbans are standardized, they're under the impression that they're secretly being converted to Christianity. And the response to this is interesting. By the 1840s, etc., it starts getting organized. In the 1840s, we already have one guy writing 6 letters to the Bombay Gazette, essentially defending India
Bhaskar,
against colonialism.
Bhaskar,
Bhaskar Pandurang,
yes.
Bhaskar Pandurang, but also critiquing Britain's economic policy, political policy, and their religious policy.
Mm.
But before that, you find these clues of Hindus standing up to this missionary pressure in different ways. My favorite is where they come up
The
with a story
Ravan, they
that
dress up Ravan as the East India Company.
Raman is dressed up as the English Governor General, so there's clearly something happening. Then missionaries notice this. But my favorite story is not that. The favorite is where they invent this old story, this old template, they adapt it because they now have Christianity in their worldview. They have to
Is it
deal
the
with
Kali
Christianity.
story?
No, they have to give Christianity a negative connotation.
Yeah.
So what do they say? They say that the Hindu traditions were doing
Yeah.
so well that all
Heaven
the
is full.
Hindus were ending up in heaven. So there was nobody left in hell, and cosmic balance was getting upset. So to recreate cosmic balance, God created Christianity so that some poor souls would end up going to hell. So Christianity was cast. So it's interesting, right? The missionary first comes in and says all your traditions are pagan, they are monster worship, they are devil worship. These, you're not actually worshiping God, you're a satanic
Mm,
sort of cult. Here there's a reversal where Hindus are now saying, Christianity exists so that some people can end up in hell, and because our traditions are actually the good ones, and we need some people in hell, and that's why Christianity was created by God as a kind of negative entity.
mm,
So you see that there are these, the emergence of what I call the path to what would become Hindutva, a political assertion and flexing of muscle by Hindus faced by the missionary and trying to figure out how is it that we deal with this, because now it is the British man in power, it is the white man ruling the country, the princely states are all collapsing and being annexed in this period
mm,
before 1857. The missionary is very visible in the streets. English, now to get a good job and to move ahead in life, you need to know the English language. So there's also a feeling that we're being deracinated. So there's a
mm,
siege mentality that's emerging among a lot of these Hindu intellectuals, and they're responding to it in various ways, which ultimately
mm.
culminates. I mean, one culmination is Hindutva
I
of all
think,
of the possible. Yeah,
yeah. At least I share some of these gripes. I share the etymology of my name with Shah Jahan as well. But his complaint that these white people don't wash their bottoms, I feel like is a fair gripe. One
yeah.
other anecdote that I found interesting was that these white people fry babies in butter, and
Oh
you
yeah.
might find it interesting that rumors like this still persist. So, in terms of the two popular sects in Pakistan, Shia and Sunni, the rumors are that Shia Halim में सुन्नी बच्चे मिलाते हैं and then Sunni
Oh
Shia
my
बच्चे
God.
मिलाते हैं. Yeah, so this same rumor somehow persists or finds its different ways, and
I didn't know that. That's
yeah,
so crazy.
so it's that's what the fascinating part about reading your book is, that you find so many connections and you see that how these narratives are formed and these narratives are repeated. For instance, like Rumila Thapar also mentions that at one point when Mahmud Ghaznavi's expedition is being, the word expedition is being translated, it's translated as holy war. The fact that
Yeah.
Mahmud Ghaznavi is going somewhere, even if it was for a vacation, it was translated as holy war to paint a certain idea. And you've mentioned the German missionaries, like Ziegenbach,
Yeah.
Bralumas Ziegenbach. It sounds like somebody
Absolutely.
J.K.
Yeah.
Rowling. Somebody
Yeah.
J.K. Rowling would name the only German student at
Yeah.
Hogwarts. when when
Yeah.
when he starts trying to understand the religion and writes back, he's told that that's not what you're sent for. You're not
You're
there
sent to
to do it.
convert the pagans.
Yes.
You're not sent to bring pagan religion into Europe. So please don't
Don't try
research
and
paganism.
don't try and make sense of this. So in terms of the Pakistani imagination as well, one of the things that's mentioned the foremost is Sati. It's repeated in our history books as it was a common practice. So what I found fascinating was that if our history books are relying on colonial stories of how much sati was taking place, you've actually done the research to say that these numbers were deliberately amplified,
Yeah.
exaggerated with the specific purpose to show how barbaric the society was so that they get more funding and more people
Yeah.
can come in.
Like everything happened. We see it in our time. No, this whole like
Yeah.
Twitter ecosystem, right? Like you create narratives and you
Yes.
create it perhaps because you're convinced that you're the right one or your side is the right one and you've got a good goal. But in order to get to that goal, you have to create a certain kind of understanding of what is happening.
Mm.
That's essentially what the missionaries did with Sati, because it's true, Sati existed. It was a very violent custom. Women were being burned alive. So they knew that it was a shocking custom and it would really jolt people
Mm.
back home and jolt them to the level that they'd make donations, they'd support the evangelical and the missionary cause. So, as I said, remember earlier, this is a time when British officials are supporting Hinduism in the sense that they're patronizing Hinduism, they're tolerating it, they're participating in rituals. Missionaries at home are saying that by doing this, you're encouraging things like sati. You're encouraging you're presiding over a you Christians, you white men are presiding over a political system where you allow women to be burned right under your noses. So they're taking it to that other extreme and they're using it to call for reform and to let themselves into India. So sometimes you find missionaries doing these very weird mathematical gymnastics. There's one missionary, I think William Ward or somebody, who basically says, okay, I estimate there are so many provinces in India. I'm estimating there's at least two satis per year in every village. I'm estimating there are X number of villages in India. And let me therefore just multiply and say that there are minimum 10,000 satis taking place in India. Whereas in reality, the
They were
actual
double
prevalence of
digit
sati,
figures.
triple digit figures in Bengal presidency, which was the place with the
Mm.
highest occurrence of sati. But in Madras and Bombay, which are the other two big parts of India, it was double digits in an entire year. And even if we say, okay, these official figures are undercounted, you multiply it by 2, 3, you're still not getting 10,000 satis every year taking place in India because it wasn't happening. There are parts of India, like where I come from in Kerala, where sati is traditionally not practiced. We have two instances from the 19th century, early 19th century, where in Bengal, at the same time, it is true that 400, 800 women, etc., are being burned every year. In Kerala, when these immigrant women want to burn themselves when their husbands die, local people and a local Rani say no. They say that in Kerala, we have no practice of sati.
Go
We'll
on
escort
site.
you to Tamil Nadu. You can go and burn there, but you can't burn yourself in Kerala. So in one case, I think that lady is paid off and she doesn't commit sati. In the other case, they escort the two women to Coimbatore across the border.
Mm.
They say, now you do what you want, but it won't happen in Kerala. So there are pockets of India where there's no sati, including in the northeast and other parts. There are pockets where sati is higher, though not at the same figures that the missionaries are banding. And there are pockets where it's happening among a few royal families and a few martial groups, etc., such as in Maharashtra or Tamil Nadu, etc. But it's not a pan cultural, pan Hindu practice. It's
Mm.
not happening everywhere all the time. But in the West, the notion is created that, oh my God, all Hindu widows are being burned constantly, and the British government is sitting silently in the name of tolerance and doing nothing. The British government is acting in an unchristian way, and that is why missionaries are needed. If you look at publications also, this is why I said it's like our Twitter and our propaganda writings of today's world. The publications, there is a kernel of truth, but there's like a whole amount of
Yes.
exaggeration that sort of plasters the rest of it, because they will say that they'll firstly put out things that are meant to titillate and shock audiences back home. So human sacrifice, we know that human sacrifice did occur,
Mm.
but again, it wasn't occurring daily, day in, day out, everywhere in India. There were some places where human sacrifice was occurring. As recently as the late 20th century, we've had cases of human
Mm.
sacrifices in some here and there pockets of India. So it's true. But the impression you get from these essays is that this is happening constantly on a daily basis, and the British government is sitting there paying money into these temples and protecting these human sacrifice temples. So there is a calculated, almost deliberate exaggeration of things with certain strategic goals that the missionary publications put out. And it's very
Mm.
clear that scholars who've studied this have very clearly identified that they also recognize that their core readership in Britain wasn't a very intellectual, evolved kind of readership. You're targeting the local farmer, the local peasant. You want them to make a few donations to the missionary cause, etc. You want them to feel be part. not of the
Mm.
established church, but of this new evangelical movement of private organizations and private committees. And for that reason, you have to make them feel a sense of interest in India. For that, you can only have simplistic stories. You can't get into high funda philosophy. You can't be debating Hinduism's esoteric concepts. You have to talk at these terms in order to get as much shock value as possible. So anybody who sees TV news debates in India or Pakistan today will know exactly the value, shock value, the dividends it pays. And that's essentially the calculation these guys also made in the 19th century when they had these publications, but also these illustrations showing all kinds of strange, barbaric practices in India, which were there, but they were not the sum total of what that culture was about.
I think nobody is watching this podcast who watches debates on television. There is these
I
Venn
doubt.
diagrams do not interact at all. It's like,
No, but I imagine some of your. I've seen you being trolled on Twitter, so I imagine some of your trolls are fans of TV debates, and they come
yeah,
here primarily to sell you.
I think Mandu, you've slowly developed the comfort after your trepidations of being cancelled by the left and right, and slowly you've become comfortable to enough to think अब तो बहुत time हो गया अब cancel नहीं होगा. I'll show you after this podcast that you could still be cancelled by both.
Good Lord. Yeah. No, but the one good thing after this book came out is I genuinely thought I would be cancelled by both sides because in different ways the book challenges and pushes back against ideological perspectives on both sides. And I think both sides have a lot of actual objective investigation to do before they parrot certain ideological lines. But what's actually happened is that both sides are reading the book, both sides are engaging with the book. So I've had, say, a right wing review on a right wing portal. They have some, grouses against me. They're like, oh, he's very condescending towards Brahmins, this, that. That's fair. It's fine. And that's their perspective. But they are engaging with the rest of the book. They are engaging in trying to understand the point I'm trying to make. And same on the left. There are people who don't entirely agree because they ideologically they can't agree. But at the same time, they recognize that I'm perhaps not coming at this with an ideological stick in my hand. I'm just trying to address certain questions. And I also will say with all humility that this is my way of trying to make sense of modern Hinduism. I noticed long ago that we are obsessed with Hindu Muslim relations, partly because this is the present day and post, like Savarkarite Hindutva depends a lot on that Hindu Muslim bifurcation, that binary, and that conflict of identity in the Indian subcontinent. But in some ways, modern Hindutva is not the sum total of modern Hinduism. Let's get that clear as well. I have a chapter on Hindutva. I don't end the book with Hindutva. I come back to Hinduism because I think
Mm,
Hindutva is just a part of this modern set of dynamics. It is not the prevailing or the total sort of end result of all of this. It is a result, not the result. Again,
mm.
so that's a bifurcation that I'm very keen to make. And therefore, for that reason, I think for me the interesting challenge was what role did Christianity and colonialism play in all of this, as opposed to just the same old narratives around Islam and Hinduism that we're so used to and on which there's so much scholarship already. So I don't want to again recreate the same kind of academic debate. I wanted to go into an area which I thought was relatively understudied. A third person may look at the emergence of modern Hinduism entirely from the prism of caste, and you may illuminate and illustrate a completely different set of dynamics that I might have missed.
Mm.
It's by bringing all of this together that we have something that we can understand, right? So I think all of these are good intellectual exercises, so long as they're done with a degree of sincerity and commitment.
I would I would assume that Hindutva followers might privilege Hindutva over Hinduism, and they might argue that Hinduism is actually a part of Hindutva, and Hindutva is the bigger umbrella that all of this comes under. I
Next,
think that
yeah.
what you're saying you do brilliantly, because what you contend with in the book is the shaping of the political identity without ever getting into what religious belief was the right belief, or whether going to the Vedas and being like, no, actually this was the original belief. I think you avoid all those landmines as well, since we've mentioned the interaction with the Muslim, and the present day Hindutva is seen from the lens of अच्छा ये हुआ इस्लामिक
Yeah.
इन्वेडर आ गए उसने खराब कर दिया something pure existed, and now as a response this is what has emerged. And what you were talking about, that for a British audience, they needed to simplify. I think even right now, for political purposes, this is why
Yeah.
academics like you, I had Dr. Janaki Bakle on, who also, despite not liking the Hindu right wing, does respect. People, at least
Hmm.
who've read the book, do give her a lot of credit for the book itself, even if
I've
in
read the book.
general,
I've read the book.
it's
Yeah,
a
yeah.
phenomenal book.
It's a remarkable book, partly also because, again, you don't have to like Savarkar, for example, to study Savarkar. You don't have to like the man, and you don't even have to endorse his ideology. But even to understand his ideology and why it's powerful, you still have to investigate the man and
Mm,
understand him fairly objectively. I can't go and think I hate this man and I'm just going to find ways to hate him more.
mm,
That's not the right way to go about research. She's done a fabulous job of looking at all the sources, especially his Marathi language
Marathi.
writings in the print media, etc. Not just his books, but also his journalism, his poetry, other
Mm,
kind of writings. And I think the picture of the man that emerges is far more complete. At the end of it, again, you may still not like Savarkar, but you understand him better. And by
mm,
understanding him better, you also understand his ideology better. So again, this is what my issue with some leftist theories, which is that even if you hate Hindutva, you need to
mm,
know what it's about before you can hate it. No, like how can
mm.
you? It doesn't logically make sense to me that you can combat something without first understanding what
Yeah.
that thing is.
And I think we see the value or the merit of engaging with academic work earnestly without an ideology. As somebody who's been critical of Travancore and has been criticized for that, while also being complimentary of their role in terms of the anti-colonial movement, and then you're blamed of whitewashing. So you see people who will not actually engage with the work or will not actually read the work will come up with their notions. But since this is the popular discussion right now, and you are also a public intellectual who engages with this idea that has now formed that the Muslim is this unitary individual who only acts out of these religious edicts, where people argue Akbar and Aurangzeb were the same, Dara Shikoh and Aurangzeb were the same, even though when you get into the nuances, you'll see that they're as different as
Yeah.
chalk and cheese. So, this notion that Muslim invaders all came with the singular purpose, you'll see Akbar destroyed temples as well. You'll
Yeah.
see Tipu Sultan, when he's invading, he's a different Tipu Sultan because he's invading, he will destroy temples. But at Mysore,
He was
he will
jihadist
employ,
language.
and
Yeah.
in Mysore, he will employ Brahmins. He will patronize
Support
temples as well.
temples.
So, this notion that the Islamic invader, and I think Ghaznavi is maybe the perfect embodiment of that, is a singular character in history and has acted on this sole impetus of destroying temples. What's your pushback against that?
See, I think in India we fall into this either or situation where one set of people will say everything was wonderful and syncretic between Hindus and Muslims. And the analogy I often give is they make it seem like in Bollywood songs people hold hands and run together in gardens, with music playing in the background. Hindus and Muslims were doing that throughout history. There was no tension. It was the British who came and created a certain interpretation of history, and that's where the tension begins. At the other end is people you are describing who see only religious conflict between Hindus and Muslims. So if you look at some of Savarkar's books, he looks at Indian history throughout the prism of, oh, Hindus against Muslims, as if there's no other factor in play at all. So that's the other extreme. In reality, you find that both of these impulses could exist not just simultaneously, but sometimes, as you were indicating with Tipu, etc., in the same person. Because
Mm,
Tipu was primarily a king. He was interested in kingly goals and kingly things. At certain moments he would privilege religion if it served certain goals. Same with Aurangzeb. He used language against Hindus when he attacked Hindu kings. So he hated Chhatrapati Shivaji in Maharashtra, so he'd call him infidel. His courtiers would call him the mountain rat and things like that. But when he had to conquer in the same region the Shia sultanates of the Deccan, the Adil Shahis of Bijapur and the Qutub Shahis of Golconda, he went all Sunni Shia. He forgot the Hindu thing and he
mm,
went Sunni Shia. Even though Aurangzeb's mother was a Shia, his own generals were Shia,
yep.
lots of Persians in his court. Even then, he used Sunni Shia differences to delegitimize those rulers. So he has a very instrumental use of religion as a king. This is not to say that personally he was one way or the other. Maybe personally also he was bigoted. Maybe personally he was a very, very, very devout Muslim. All of that can be simultaneously true because human beings and human societies are complicated. There was Hindu Muslim violence, that is a part of history. There were temples that were demolished, etc. But you also find the other end of the spectrum, which is that people are also capable of getting along. Both can again exist simultaneously. So I think this simplistic notion of, oh, the invader, it is not a historically sound or complete notion, yet it is a politically favorable and useful concept, which is why it keeps gaining life constantly because politically it serves purposes. Remember, communities also are constantly imagining and reimagining themselves. So, right now, if the investment is in one majoritarian Hindu identity, it needs that other. It needs an equally simplified, simplistic enemy to focus on. And Aurangzeb, the invader, these are motifs that are useful in cementing this
Mm,
identity. And
mm,
therefore, there is value invested in that, and lots of people prefer to believe it.
mm,
And sometimes the thing with being human also is, no matter how much evidence you throw at somebody, emotionally people want to believe what they want to believe. Ideologically,
mm,
people want to believe what they want to believe. So I think there is a kind of scholarly practice where you try to be dispassionate and understand why things are happening. And then there's a kind of practice where you've already decided this is what I want, and I'm now going to arrange everything around this so that this is the shape of the final product, because I've already decided this is what I want. So it's again apples and oranges. This conflict and this tension is always going to continue.
mm,
Scholarly inquiries into history are done with a certain set of goals to understand the past. Emotional slash political slash social interest in history is much more, let's say, fluid, in the sense that
mm.
it's not looking at things in a scholarly or dispassionate way. It is deliberately looking at things in an emotional way. And again, I'm not saying that is bad or good. Both are always going to coexist. And I think if you want an intelligent society, they also need to be in dialogue with each other. And some of this scholarly thing has to influence the way our
mm.
emotions function as well.
I think this is why I really love the way you start the book with the story, but just writing style has been compared to Game of Thrones. It's
Yeah,
like in a book of fiction, it really sets the world for us that here's the Maharaja of Jaipur. He's almost using religion, or he's molding religion to achieve his end political goals. What he wants at the end, he
it's a
needs
trip.
that. So now he has to find space in religion to achieve that. That's what Ayub Khan used to do a lot more blatantly in Pakistan as well, where he used to decide what the law will be. And
Yeah,
then the clergy was responsible for making it Islamic for his purposes. So then you're already thrown into this world where you see that religion may seem like it's central. You mentioned Ram Mohan Roy as well, who may not have ascribed to that Hindu identity, but then saw the value in the Hindu political identity. And you see it across the board. Right now, Israel Palestine is seen from a religious end. But when you read Theodore Herzl's work, it's a lot more practical debate. A lot of the initial Zionists are not practicing Jews. In fact, the rabbis are against them. And the discussion
yeah,
of where Israel should be formed is a political consideration. They're considering Nigeria, they're considering Argentina, they're considering Palestine, specifically in terms of the Hindu Muslim unity argument.
yeah,
There is what the left says is that the Hindu Muslim conflict was created by the British. I think you bring
mm,
great nuance to that, that the Hindu Muslim conflict existed, maybe not to the extent where
yeah,
we saw 1947 happened. What the British invented was communalism. So I'd love for you to
yeah.
speak on that nuance, that जहाँ साथ रहते हो मसले मसाइल तो हो जाते हैं, but the notion of communalism and what it became eventually, that is a British invention.
Yeah, because the moment you start, this goes back to that bit we were talking about the census, right? Because the moment you start counting people, the British are doing it firstly to understand who they are governing. They are looking at this very mechanically. They're outsiders. They need to make sense of this country. And very much like our tech bros today and technocratic people with technocratic solutions for complicated societies, they're like, okay, firstly let's count and classify these people and see what we're dealing with in
Mm,
total. But by creating that classification, you're also creating a new way for those communities to look at themselves. So the Muslim leaders are also realizing, oh, we've actually, our like Muslim political leaders, like the Mughals, have been ruling this country, but in reality, we're a minority. So that creates a certain crisis of Muslim identity, Muslim political identity. The Hindus feel, oh, we are the majority in this country. Why are we not getting more of, or they feel that they're not getting enough of the share of the state or government offices, etc. Why do the Muslims have so much importance? They'll fashion their self-image because of that. And this is where the seeds of communalism emerge. Even like I forget where it was. I think it was Bengal, where after the census, people were shocked to realize that Bengal had, I think, a Muslim majority after the first census, and the people had no idea that it was a Muslim majority state. Neither the Hindus nor the Muslims, that region, because nobody had gone around counting this. So the moment you create that new concept that numbers matter, and based on your numbers, the British will determine how much power you have in the order that they've created, people start competing for the pies and the loaves of offices and so on. Their communalism emerges because it becomes a game of majority, minority, which we are still living with. In earlier times, yes, there was sectarian violence. Yes, there was religious violence. Yes, there was caste violence. The past was a very violent place. In different ways, this kind of violence kept happening. But now, as communal identities came in, new identities also need new histories for themselves. They need new genealogies for themselves. And because we have all these ingredients in our history, it's very easy to construct a genealogy for practically anything.
Mm.
Savarkar can easily write a history in which everything is about Hindus standing up to Muslims and Muslims torturing Hindus. Muslims can write a very glorified history about how they were born as a ruling race in India, etc. And therefore, it's not just their numbers; they deserve a higher status because they've been a ruling class for so long and for so
Yeah.
many centuries.
We call
You
that
can
Park
also
studies.
you're going to get trolled. I can see.
It's
I can see which part of this conversation you will be trolled. But yeah, so I think people also invest in history to use those elements of history that serve their communal identities better and use that to give themselves a history. That's what I said. Communities are constantly imagining and reimagining themselves, and
Mm.
they're constantly giving themselves fresh histories based on selective readings of the past. The job of the historian is to stand aside and look at this objectively and say, hold on, here are the processes by which this idea of history, this idea of identity has emerged. You may not like it because this identity, once an identity is created, it becomes real. That's also the thing, no? Once an identity is cemented in concept, once enough people buy into it, it becomes real. And that's why no matter how much historical nuance you throw at it, it's tough to then cross that bridge because you've already solidified this.
Yeah, and how these identities are formed specifically with these interjections. For instance, this notion that now exists in Pakistan that Muslims of the subcontinent spoke Urdu.
Yeah.
That was a notion that was created by the British, popularized by the British, and now that same thing was used to reaffirm the Muslim identity that we're Muslims, we speak Urdu. What I found interesting was that if I contrast it with the writings of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan or the opinion of Liaquat Ali Khan, they went to Aligarh University, which was established by the British. They acquired a British education, but their worldview tended to be pro-British. It did not go anti-colonial. Whereas a lot of people that you mentioned, especially Hindu nationalists, it's also interesting that Gandhi discovered the Gita through an English translation of the Gita. Then the Gita became like an integral text of using it against the British. So the philosophical ideas which were being taught, this education that was being given, with maybe the purpose of creating this colonial Babu class, but those same ideas were used against them. I don't know if you would dare contrast or at least opine on why the experience of these Hindu nationals may have differed from the experience of the Muslim nationals.
Well, I can't comment on the Muslim nationalists because I haven't studied that at any great length, but there are others who've done it, so maybe they're more qualified to answer it. But on the Hindus, you can see it. I'm glad you mentioned the Gita because if you look at it again, one text, right? Usually in pre-modern times, used and studied by a Brahminical elite, not even all Brahmins, an elite type of scholarly Brahmin had access and interest in the Gita, but a good condensation of what you would call Hindu philosophy and Vedanta and things like that. What happens is in the British period, the British are looking for something that represents Hinduism. And people like Warren Hastings want to show critics in Britain that, oh, Hindus are good. They have their own traditions. You don't need missionaries. You don't need foreign influence too much. They're good, reasonable people. We just need to halke se rule over them and keep them in order. So they translate the Gita, hoping to persuade people at home and keep some of these lobbies away at home. And they also translate the Gita, hoping that through doing that, through giving the Gita this kind of reverence and respect and showing that they're also admiring and respecting the Gita, they will command the loyalties of the Hindus. So the Hindus will also become loyal to the British rulers because the British are glorifying and celebrating Hindu texts, etc. That happens. By the mid 19th century, you find a missionary warning that you better be careful. You're focusing on the philosophy of the Gita and the content of the Gita. You're forgetting that the Gita is taking place on a battlefield where the main protagonist is hesitating to go to war, and God is telling him, "Look, you have to do your duty. Forget the rest of it, but you have to go ahead and do this." And he's like, any mutineer in the British army who wants to stand up against the British can use the Gita and justify mutiny in the British army. So the Gita is actually a dangerous text. So the same Gita that the British glorified for their ends and their goals and to command Indian loyalty towards them. By the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, it's being called the Revolutionaries Manual. Because every time they actually do find revolutionaries who are throwing bombs and shooting British officials, many of them are carrying copies of the Gita on them because they've now interpreted the same Gita as a martial text. So Tilak interprets the Gita as a martial text. Gandhi, who's essentially a younger contemporary of Tilak's, interprets the Gita in a very different way. They're both looking at the same text. Just as the British are looking at this text at a different period, Indian nationalists also looking at it at a different period, revolutionaries also looking at it at a different period. Tilak is looking at it one way, Gandhi is looking at it in another way, and each is interpreting that text for their own respective purposes. Again, that I think is a very human trait. To go back to my earlier point, we will always find genealogies and roots for to justify anything really that we create in the world, because even these things we create in the world are a consequence of history, right? So naturally there's going to be some historical elements you'll always be able to draw out and emphasize, saying that these are the roots of such and such present day dynamics in our lives. So again, these are all just intricate, highly sort of interwoven dynamics. It's very tough to simplify, and I don't think the point of history is to you can communicate history in a simplified way, but there's a difference between simplified and simplistic, and I think that is very important as well.
I think that's why the work of historians becomes crucial in many ways. I think the notion of jihad right now is associated with Islam, with all these Islamic jihad organization, and that's a conversation that happens in India often as well. But when you look at the creation of Taliban, it was specifically with American intervention that the jihad component or the violent component of Islam was highlighted, was printed in the US, then was distributed all across Pakistan. Suddenly, the political climate changed, and then they became the enemies, and then in a post 9/11 world, would you say that the rise of Hindutva also coincides with that period because there was this narrative around the world where the Muslim was seen as the enemy, and that sort of also influenced the rise of Hindutva in India?
I think, for me, liberalization is far more a milestone in this, because I've noticed that after liberalization, as prosperity grew in India, as more and more people joined the ranks of the middle class, there you see a reflowering of religious identity taking place across India. Again, even where I come from in Kerala, one example I give these days is how Dalit boys in my ancestral village, we have a temple festival where the chariots of the gods are pulled. Back in the day, upper caste men used to do this. Now what's happened is most of the upper caste men are in Dubai making money and building fancy houses for their family back home. So when the festivals happen, there aren't that many of these men available anymore, the erstwhile upper caste groups. These Dalit boys, on the other hand, politically, they always vote for the Communist Party. These are family traditions. You will politically always vote for the communists. But that doesn't mean you're irreligious or you don't go to the temple. It is now that you're even able to access the temples. And they've abandoned, partly because of Sanskritization, etc., the old gods, who I simplistically call, or simply call the non-vegetarian gods that were once worshipped, and Brahmins would call the inferior gods. They've been abandoned, and now everybody's going to the big temple. And the same Dalit boys who will vote commie and communist, in the temple procession, they gain a different kind of social capital and sense of pride from pulling the rathams
Mm.
of the gods, right? So there is post-liberalization. As people become wealthier, it's not as if they're going into some progressive utopia. In many ways, there's a revival of tradition that takes place. There are studies, and this isn't a modern phenomenon alone. I forget where I read about it, but I remember reading that Durga Pujas in Bengal became bigger and bigger and bigger and grander. Even now, it's a very grand affair. But a lot of that grandeur comes from the British period, where under the British, a lot of these dubashas, their Indian secretaries and Indian supporters, were starting to earn money. And one way of flaunting it was by having grand Durga Pujas. So people started competing for grander Durga Pujas. And that's how that became a huge phenomenon. In Madras, and I quote it in the book, wherein British officials sort of sniffs that in this country, when men have money, they have no better way of flaunting it than by building even bigger temples. And that's also true. It's happening around us, at this time. 21st century India last year just inaugurated a very important but also very controversial temple in Ayodhya
Mm.
with the prime minister present. But at the same time, we've also got our, I know, Mars mission, this, that. So it's this whole notion that, oh, we will only go in a progressive is actually not true. Societies also keep relying and making sense of themselves and who they are through engagements with history. So where people say that, oh, how awkward that we have a mass mission, but also we have the Ayodhya Ram temple. Actually, it's not awkward at all. It makes total sense. If you look at it, if you include the economic dynamics in it, if you look at the way society has evolved, if you look at the way how these families have now become middle class, and when you become middle class, you also want, now you have time and energy to invest in identity. Now you have time and energy to invest in who are we as a people. And in answering those questions, you fall back on tradition. So it's all again very interlinked. And I think some of the new religiosity we're seeing is actually linked to economic triumphs and globalization and things like that.
What you spoke about in terms of this assertion of your identity, what I thought was a brilliant example was the contrast between Ambedkar and Gandhi. The notion that
Yeah,
since Ambedkar comes from a lower caste, loincloth is what he wears anyway. So wearing a
yeah,
suit, sort of,
yeah,
that's his resistance to that, or that's his
yeah,
rebellion. Whereas for Gandhi, who's an upper caste Hindu,
yeah,
he's using that line. The loincloth itself doesn't change, but what it represents changes. Uh,
Yeah.
I know you have another recording after that as well, and people have sent in a lot of questions. But before we do a rapid fire of those for five
Hold on, is this
minutes,
live?
no, but people have
Oh,
sent it.
okay.
I announced that you're coming. So,
Okay.
in terms of encountering the other, what you mentioned throughout the book, and I would really urge everybody to read the book. In terms of overseas Indians, the fact that you said these people have gone abroad, and I also see this reassertion of the Indian identity, whether that's Howdy Modi at
Yeah.
Madison Square Garden. That's true for Pakistanis as well. So this new class of overseas Pakistanis that have emerged as a political constituency, or the Sharia in the UK movement, supporters of that, they tend to hold notions of what it means to be a Pakistani, what it means to be a Muslim, a lot closer than people in Pakistan. So I'm sure it's similar with
And
India, where they're informing the Hindu identity back home.
often in a much more textbooky way, compared
Mm.
to people who actually live here, whose everyday experience is still sort of mediated by so many other institutions and not just some outline of formal idea of religion. For a lot of people who live abroad, I think because they're in an alien culture, they become more and more alert of their identity. In fact, in this book, I talk about this bit, I think towards the end in the epilogue, where a lot of Christians in Europe who are fighting as Protestants, Catholics, and whose is the right version of Christianity, when they came to India, their sense of a common shared Christianity grew stronger because now they were in alien culture. And there was a Jesuit who met a Catholic who met one of these Protestant British ambassadors in, I think, Jahangir's court. And he says that in this court, we should be Christians first and not Protestant in Catholic, because here we have a different agenda and a different goal. So they're more aware of their Christianness when they're in India, as opposed to Christians who are actually in Europe and fighting over Protestant versus Catholic, and not about pagans and Christianity and who was and Christianness as one category. So I think it's the same phenomenon. When you live in an
Mm.
alien culture, you somehow become, I think, more alert to a textbooky idea of religion, whereas the people living back home might be evolving in a completely different direction. And again, that's just one of the ways of the world.
I'm going to make you do something antithetical to your existence. You have 10 seconds to offer simplistic answers to all
Good
these
Lord.
questions. Who is the most underrated leader of Indian modern history? And
Most underrated. I think I have a friend called Rahul Sagar who's doing a book on a man called Sati Madhav Rao. Unheard of today. Most Indians would not have heard this man's name. But in the 19th century, he was seen as a very important statesman and was one of those iconic Indians who learned English, wasn't completely anti-British, but at the same time did feel that India had to, find its own political destiny, etc.
Mhm.
Wrote extensively, worked in the princely states, and tried to set up these model states as an answer to British colonial rule, and proved to the British that Indian Rajas and Indians did not necessarily need the white man to govern the country, etc. I think he's an interesting figure who should be studied and understood more.
Isn't the Indian reservation system, which is mainly based on Hindu caste system, a factor in systematic discrimination against minorities?
Systematic discrimination against minorities. How is the reservation system a discrimination? I don't know. It doesn't make sense to me. I think the
Okay.
reservation system is a healthy system. Perhaps it needs a few tweaks here and there, but I think positive discrimination is a healthy phenomenon. And yeah, I don't know how it discriminates against minorities. Hmm.
Is reconstruction of religious thought in Hinduism needed to create a Hindu identity in sync with the modern world? Is it out of
I
sync?
mean, no, no. I mean, forget that. Whether we want it or not, reconstruction is always happening. What we think about is tradition and then some kind of great modern reconstruction is not true. Tradition is also constantly amending itself through all those centuries. We just lump it now under tradition because it's different from us. Whereas in future also there'll be a reading of Hinduism that is different. 1,000 years ago, Hinduism was different. As you said, at one point it was Indra and Agni, then it became Vishnu and Shiva. Now there's a globalized version of modern Hinduism that's interacted with Christianity and Islam. And in future, it may have a completely different face. It's natural. It's always evolving. It's always restructuring.
Ask him why Brahminism controls Hinduism in many ways.
Actually,
Read the book.
Brahmanism doesn't necessarily control Hinduism, but Brahmanism in many ways tried to explain and give an overarching narrative to Hinduism. And in a time where nationalism and having that overarching shared identity became important, Brahmanism became far more reinforced because it already had the ingredients to help fuse it with nationalism compared to, say, more regional cults and more regional traditions. So I think a lot of the power of Brahmanism comes from the fact that it can address the needs of the modern world and it can fuse itself with nationalism.
How truthful is the claim of Indian right wing that Bharat was a united civilization?
See, the concept of civilization itself, scholars will now debate, because there is no such thing as one civilization. These cultures are constantly in dialogue and movement and exchange with each other. So things don't happen in a vacuum. But I don't think it was a united. I mean, the word united civilization doesn't make sense, right? You can have a united state, you can have a united political authority, but a cultural space is necessarily going to be a different kind of commodity and a different kind of entity.
Mhm.
Even in the ancient period, if you read William Dalrymple's book, you'll find this reference to how when Alexander's armies invaded, one sannyasi was asked, "What is your homeland?" And he said, "The land between the Himalayas and the seas, and the Indus and the sea at the other side." Essentially, the Indian subcontinent is his homeland. But that doesn't mean it was one country. It was one cultural zone, sure, but it was a very diverse place with lots of elements of commonality as well.
Yeah, then you also find these religious beliefs that if you go to Sindh or you go to Bengal, then you become impure. And I think you also mentioned
Yeah,
that if you die on the other side of the Patna River, you're
yeah, yeah.
impure. So these
I think
notions,
yeah, yeah, yeah. You have to
the
cross
no,
the river and die on the right side, because that if you die there, then you become a donkey in your next birth. That was the
so if the
belief.
belief system is that Sindh and Bengal are impure, but when you're creating a national political identity, then you have to
Yeah,
harken back to a day where all of this was one.
yeah.
Uh, does he think the efforts of establishing a one dominant Hindu identity by the Hindu nationalists can result in the homogenization of distinct Hindu cultures across India?
That is happening to a certain extent. And I'm, again, for me, the question is, and it's really a personal conundrum, which is that it's a process. And objectively speaking, it is a process like so many other processes in the world. There is indeed a homogenization happening. It personally, do I like it? I don't like it, because I feel that diversity is beautiful. I feel that diversity is important. But again, it's tough to to figure this one out, because that homogenization is happening. It is true,
How
whether we
valid
like it
is
or not. Underway.
how valid is the Aryan invasion theory? I think the Aryan migration theory is completely valid.
And I think this is a tired debate now. There's more and more genetic evidence coming to light showing that there was definitely an influx of people over several centuries into India from outside the Indian subcontinent. We don't need to fight about it. It wasn't just from that direction. Other people came from other directions into the Indian subcontinent as well. It's very silly for us to imagine that everything has to emerge, or from this one zone alone, and nobody could have come in from elsewhere.
Yeah,
It's linked to various other things, but yeah, I don't think we should get caught up
yeah.
on
There
this.
are a lot more questions, but since we're out of time, I'll leave you with this one. How does he see the modern Indian cinema attempts at remodeling history, especially pre-colonization times?
I think modern Indian cinema is responding to modern incentives of the modern market. At the moment, it's fashionable to make hyper nationalistic, hyper Hindu, hyper masculine movies, and there is therefore an investment in that. Cinema is ultimately a reflection of what a society is going through. So I don't think I'm going to sit and blame cinema. I think we all have to look inward and as a society correct the way we're headed, and maybe then you'll see better cinema.
Yeah, and I think you've spoke. Was it News Laundry where you spoke about Aurangzeb and Chava? So if people are specifically interested in that, since there were a lot of questions, go and watch that. Thank you so much, and everybody, please do read the book. It's phenomenal, and thank you for all the work that you do, both as a
Thank you.
writer
Thank
and
you
as a
for
public
having me.
intellectual.
Pleasure to be here again. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.